All right, so continuing in our discussion of the westernization and modernization of Russia, now I'm still giving you some historical background, but today we're going to talk about Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine the Great rules Russia from 1762 to 1795. So again, I'm still giving you historical background, just to kind of give you some ideas of how Russia gets to the place that it does. So the first question we're going to talk about is, how did Catherine the Great contribute to the policy of westernization? So Catherine the Great is actually Catherine the Second, because if you remember from the last video, Catherine the First was actually the successor of Peter the Great, which was Peter the Great's wife. So Catherine the Great, interestingly enough, she's not Russian. She's not even named Catherine. So she was from a minor state in what today is Germany. She was in an arranged marriage to the grandson of Peter the Great. Her name was Sophia originally. She was Catholic. When she came to Russia, I think when she was engaged to Peter, she was like 15 years old. Peter being Peter the Great's grandson. She comes to Russia. She learns Russian. She takes the name Catherine or Katerina, which would be the Russian name. She converts to Orthodox Christianity, marries Peter's grandson Peter. It was a very unhappy marriage. They did not really get along very well. Peter, her husband, was not the strongest of characters. I believe he had some mental issues. They did have one son together named Paul. And then the nobles, who are referred to as the boyars in Russia, were not really that happy with Peter because he was fascinated with Prussia, which today is Germany, which is one of the reasons why he was excited about marrying Catherine, or really Sophia, because she was from Germany. He had this great affinity with Germany for some reason, was fascinated with it. Russia was fighting a war with Prussia, which is Germany, and the Russians were winning, and he actually stops the war because he was so upset because he didn't want to defeat Prussia because he loved them so much. And his boyars, the nobles, were like, "Are you out of your mind? How can you do this?" So basically the boyars decided that they are going to stage a coup d'etat and put Catherine in his place. So that puts Catherine into a kind of precarious situation in some ways because she's really there at the behest of the nobles. She claims now when Peter was overthrown, he was kidnapped, and then he subsequently was, accidentally sort of, quote unquote, died. Catherine always claimed that she had nothing to do with it, and she didn't know he was going to be murdered. She just thought he was going to be exiled. Whether she knew, we don't really know. She technically is ruling and regent for her son Paul, and then she's supposed to give power to her son when her son comes of age. She never does that. So she has a really bad relationship with her son because her son sees her versus the reason why he doesn't have power. He blames her for his father's death. It's a really bad relationship. Also add to it the fact that when Paul has a son, she kind of basically takes the son and decides that she's going to raise him herself and doesn't really have much contact with his son. So there's bad blood between her son and herself. But she tries to continue the policy of westernization. She appointed officials only that were given a Western education, kind of like Peter, because she really tried to make a connection between herself and Peter to kind of justify her rule, because really she had no place in the government. That is an image of her husband, Peter. That's a family portrait of herself and Peter and their son, Paul. This is a statue she had commissioned of Peter the Great to kind of, like I said, kind of make this connection between herself and Peter. All said and done, though, she was a very effective ruler. She ruled for a very long time. She ruled for over 30 years. She did do some really impressive things for the empire, and she really did have a desire to make Russia a more modern, enlightened state. Some people will consider her what's referred to as an enlightened despot. So again, she appointed officials only with Western education. She tried to reorganize the empire into 50 provinces, each led by a governor general. She also wanted to reform the Constitution. She wanted to create what's called the Charter of the Nobility and the Charter of Towns. But there was limit to how much power, what she could do to kind of curtail the power of the nobles, because again, she was dependent on the nobles for support. So in the end, she wound up giving the nobles a lot more power over the peasants in return to gain loyalty to herself. She did like to consider herself, though, an enlightened despot. She encouraged her nobles to visit Western Europe. She was really interested in the ideas of the enlightened philosophers. One philosopher in particular, Diderot, he was famous for his library, and she had a great correspondence with Diderot. And when Diderot was kind of like, he had this massive library, he actually was the editor of the first encyclopedia of the world, and he had this massive library, and when he was kind of like down on his luck financially, he was going to have to start selling off the library, and she thought that the fact that he had this collection of work of all these different authors and on all these different subjects, she thought this needed to stay together, so she actually buys the whole library and allows Diderot to keep it for the rest of his life so that he doesn't have to sell all his books. So she has this kind of relationship with them. And she did want to improve the lives of her subjects, but she also was a Russian autocrat, and she didn't want to give up any of her own power. She did want to do things like end torture and beating and mutilation. She wanted to end all those practices, and she really wanted to try to make Russia a more enlightened society. However, these things are going to change, and we'll talk about that here. Why did Catherine stop her reforms? Now, despite her desire to make Russia a more enlightened and Western state, she also did not tolerate challenges to her rule. And this man here, in 1773, is going to stage a rebellion. His name is Pugachev. And he is going to stage a rebellion that's referred to as Pugachev's Rebellion. And it was a pretty serious rebellion. Pugachev was a Cossack. The Cossacks lived kind of in Central Asia, part of Russia, and so he led a group of disgruntled Cossacks, exiles, peasants, serfs, and what his program wanted to do is he wanted to end taxes, limit government supervision over their lives, end the military draft, and he wanted the people to be able to elect their leaders. So Pugachev's army is going to kill thousands of nobles, kill government officials, kill priests. And Pugachev actually tried to claim, because remember her husband Peter was kidnapped and then murdered and overthrown, but there was never any bodies, so there was all these speculation about what really happened to Peter. So Pugachev claimed to be the rightful ruler of Russia. He claimed to be Peter and claimed to be the rightful ruler of Russia. So the rebellion was pretty widespread. There you can see there's an image of Pugachev kind of holding court as pretending to be Peter, the actual Tsar of Russia. He eventually is captured. He is brought back to St. Petersburg in a cage. He is beheaded, quartered, and his body parts are displayed throughout the city. So that kind of ended her whole, ban against torture. The other thing that kind of ended her reforms was the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is going to happen around the time that Catherine is in power as well. And she sees all of these changes that are going on in France, and she's like, well, that's not going to happen in Russia. And she really kind of starts to close Russia off to those ideas, because she didn't want those types of ideas of rebellion and democracy and liberty and equality and all those things to spread into Russia. Now the last question, though, and actually let me just show you before I talk about that. This is the palace that she lived in, called Tarske Selo. It was actually built by one of Peter's daughters. I believe it was Elizabeth that lived here originally. But there's some of the images. You can see kind of what the Russian Baroque architecture style is. This room here is completely covered in amber. You can kind of see that whole room is just amber. So very richly decorated. But the last question is, how did Catherine II become known as Catherine the Great? So what land did she actually bring into Russia? So she launched a series of campaigns against the Ottomans. And as a result, she's going to gain Crimea and the northern coast of the Black Sea. So that means that Russia is actually going to be able to get to the Black Sea. Now the issue is they still can't get out of the Black Sea because that's controlled by the Ottoman Empire. This area here, this is the ultimate goal the Russians want, because they want to be able to get out of the Black Sea, which is why Russia's going to eventually want to fight in the Crimean War, which we mentioned in regards to the Ottomans. We're going to talk about the Crimean War later. She also gained control of what today is Georgia, which I believe is in this area over here. And she gained that land from the Ottomans because she said that the Georgians were Orthodox, and the Orthodox Christians in Georgia were fearing the Turks, and they were looking to Russia for protection. So she gets control of Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea. She gains control of Georgia. She gives the nobles in the area the same privileges as Russian boyars. She also is going to colonize land in Siberia, and she's going to claim Alaska, because if you remember anything from 8th grade Seward's Folly, we purchased Alaska, I believe, from Russia for $24 million. So she claims Alaska. In Siberia and Alaska, she set up, there was a large fur trapping industry, which was actually making a lot of money for Russia. Her other major thing that she did is, if you look on this map, there's a big kind of country that's missing. So roughly in this area is the country of Poland, but we see it's not there. So Poland was a very large country in Eastern Europe, but it was also a very weak country. The nobles had a lot of power, and in order for anything to get done, every noble had veto power. So if you were trying to pass any type of law in Poland, if one noble didn't agree, then the law couldn't be passed. So it was a very weak, decentralized government in Poland. And so Catherine is going to be the architect of the partition of Poland. Poland is going to be partitioned in 1772. They're going to be partitioned again in 1793. And then they're going to be partitioned in 1795. By 1795, there no longer is a Poland. So basically what happens is Austria, Prussia, and Russia. So Russia, Prussia, and Austria are going to basically chip away at Poland. Each kind of slice off a little bit of it and give it to themselves in 1792, again in 1793. And by 1795, it doesn't exist anymore. This helps to make Russia a major world power in Europe. It also creates a really bad precedent for countries that are weak, because Poland wasn't bothering anyone. They weren't fighting a war with anybody. They were minding their own business, and just because they didn't have a strong government, they get carved up by these larger powers. So Russia, Prussia, and Austria are patting themselves on the back, like, look at us, we didn't have a war, we were able to peacefully negotiate the partition of land, this is great, we're so wonderful. Meanwhile, Poland really suffers as a result of it. But this helps to make Russia into a major power in Eastern Europe, especially gaining the land that she gained from the Ottomans. And that's why she is considered to be called Catherine the Great. So why was Westernization not such a successful policy in Russia? Because we have some fits and starts with attempting to make Russia really a westernized society. I want you to think about that. And then in class, we're going to be talking about Russia in the 19th century, which is actually the century we're up to talking about in class, and some of the major issues that Russia goes through to try to industrialize themselves and reform themselves and catch up to Western Europe, since they are always behind Western Europe.